Hi everyone. Today's video is going to be a rough stab at attempting to answer one of the old questions. Is an expensive guitar better than a cheap guitar for recording? I mean, it's a bit of an open question, so in this case I'm going to use the cheapest guitar that I have with the most expensive guitar that I've been able to get my hands on. This isn't actually mine, this belongs to my dad. This is a PRS Tremonti. This is a USA Tremonti, and it's about the most expensive guitar bar the PRS Super Eagle that I've ever seen. Went to see Paul Reed Smith and met the man in person a couple of years ago, and we took this lovely guitar with us and he signed it for us very graciously on the back. So we've got Paul's handwriting on the back, and it's about, if you were to buy one of these new with this specification, you're looking at about $5,000, which is incredible. It's a mahogany body, it's got a single piece quilted maple top, a flame maple neck, all the relevant hardware including the Tremonti neck pickup and bridge pickup. So it's all as it came, nothing has had to be upgraded because it's just perfect. And also the strings, it's been set up at Sound Effects Premiere over near Liverpool. Sound Effects, their setup team are absolutely spot on. And it just so happened that while it was in for a setup, the rep, Adam from Diodario UK, was there and has had this set up with 10-46 Diodario NYXLs. I've used NYXLs before and they do feel absolutely great. So that brings me on to the guitar I'm going to be comparing it with. This is not a Fender Stratocaster, this is what's called a Sunn Mustang, which is a lot like a Strat. This, when it was bought, was about 50 or 60 pounds, which compared to the several thousand for the other one is quite the difference. Now, it's not strictly worth that, really. Well, I mean, I couldn't sell it for much more, but I've paid quite a lot over the years to have this kept in a good condition. This was my first guitar. I learnt on this when I was about 11 years old, and yet it's still, this has a lower action and a more level neck in some ways than the PRS does. The wood, this was made in the late 80s, so the wood is about 30 years old. It's pretty vintage by this point. And it's a classic kind of Strat with, I think it's an ash body, and it's got a rosewood fingerboard and whatever the necks are usually made out of on a Strat type thing. But this was made in India. Sunn were a company, I don't know if they're still going, but these were all handmade as far as I'm aware. The original electronics were awful, so I got them replaced with a set of Artec mini humbucker pickups, which you can coil tap by pulling all the separate different pots out. And this is now one of my main studio guitars because I've had this professionally set up by a guy called the Manchester Guitar Tech, Steve Robinson. And he skimmed the frets, leveled everything, and even though it's a battered old thing, it's got one of the best tones that I can conjure out of any guitar. Is that because I'm so used to this guitar? Some would say, but every time I put this guitar in the hands of someone in the studio, they always comment on how well it plays and how good it sounds. So there is something to it, I'm sure. Now, this has a gloss finish on the back of the neck where the Tremonti has a satin finish. All the electronics are in the cavity, which means there's a downside that if I tap the cavity, you can hear quite a loud thud, 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 thud on the pickups. But aside from that, let's cut to the chase. I recorded a minute's worth of audio for this, so let's see how it sounds back to back. So there is definitely something in it, but it might not have been as close as you might have thought. It is a little more difficult to keep the cheap one in tune. The locking tuners on the Tremonti make things much easier. I've had to block off the trem on this Mustang, whereas the trem is floating free on the PRS, but is still perfectly solid. One thing I didn't mention before we went into the demo is, even though the PRS was restrung with Diodario NYXLs, I also restrung this one with the same, with the 10-46 set NYXLs, to make sure that these were exactly the same. It just so happened that after that 7-string test that we did a little while back, and you can check that video out in that little I button in the corner, we still had a 7-string set of NYXLs handy, so I just took away the bottom string and that instantly became a 10-46 set. So that's these. So the only tonal difference is between the pickups, the electronics, the wood, the resonance of the body. I mean, that brings me to kind of a conclusion. It was no surprise to me that there was a lot more sustain on the solo on the Tremonti, where this one kind of dies off after a while, because the woods that this is made out of, you can see it's kind of blackened. It's an interesting feature of the wood, but it was never like chosen by an expert for its tonal properties. I'll bet that there were hundreds of these made, and I may have just been quite lucky that this one even sounds nearly as good as it does. And maybe that's the conclusion that I've come to with price of instruments, that if you only have a set budget for a guitar and you're going to buy something new, maybe if you have, I don't know, £300-400 for a guitar, because if you do look in the £50 region, you're not going to find anything good these days. Like, this was £50 or £60 back in 1992, 93, back when I was small. So adjusting for inflation then, let's say you've got £300 for something like, I don't know, a Squier guitar or an Epiphone or something. My advice would be, try every one in the shop of the same model, because the way the guitars are thrown together, they can be fairly well made, but they will have a bit of a lottery about them, where the tone of the wood is not something that the builders would necessarily be stopping to think about, whereas the Paul Reed Smith, especially the USA factory, they knock on every piece of wood, they listen for the tone. They make sure that each piece of wood resonates properly before even choosing it. They put the necks together and let them dry in an air temperature controlled room for months before they're used, so that the neck will be perfect when it's made. They do all those little things that make it take longer and cost more. But if I won the lottery, if I was a millionaire, if I had a budget that was absolutely crazy, and I had to turn up at a stage, I had to arrive somewhere without my guitars and without my gear, I would always say, out of any choice you can get me something like a PRS to use, because I know that they will be a good enough quality that I can just walk on stage if someone's tuned it for me and I'll play a great show. Whereas with a lower priced instrument, if it's your personal instrument and you've spent the time and learned how to look after them and have them set up properly and make sure all the wiring isn't damaged and so on and so forth, then it's fine. But if it's just straight out of a box, there are a lot more questions to ask. I think that's my conclusion there. So I hope you found this useful. Give it a like if you found this interesting, and stick around. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because that's really appreciated. We're starting to pick some momentum up now. We're at nearly 3,500 subscribers at this point. I think once we get past the 10,000 mark, if we do, I mean, fingers crossed, that'll really give us some weight to be able to then call up guitar companies and be like, can we do a review on this, a review on that? Because people want to see reviews of gear that are relatively unbiased and with some insight. Hopefully I can do that for you. So I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pole Studios. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.